All right, so today we're going to talk about marketing research. We were supposed to have this topic on the first exam, but we sort of ran out of time, so I'm going to get through this fairly quickly. This is the really boring part of marketing for most students, and it brings back bad memories. The ethics part is the part that I really like, and the students generally don't like that either because there are more questions than there are answers. And so on the first exam, there was an essay question that asked you about an ethical dilemma in marketing. And it asks you for a well-reasoned, rational, comprehensive explanation of your decision-making process in regard to that. And there have been a lot of questions, and so I thought I would sort of give you some hints. Because the exam is open note, open book, open neighbor, what I expect for an essay on that kind of exam is more than what I would expect if I were giving the essay in class, right? I expect you to go beyond sort of the text. A lot of the emails that I've gotten have said, well, there's nothing in the text. It's amazing what's not in the text. You could have probably found a lot of information if you just went to my YouTube channel. I mean, I realize that this is a shameless plug for my YouTube channel, but I teach marketing ethics. We teach a course here called Marketing Ethics. And all of my marketing ethics lectures are on YouTube. So you could go and you could look at ancient moral philosophy. You could look at modern moral philosophy. You could look at the videos on corporate social responsibility from that series. So if you just go to my YouTube channel, you'll find lots of stuff there. There is a very abbreviated ethics lecture that we produced for our sales competitions because we always have an ethics case study at the sales competitions. And so I did a very abbreviated sort of lecture. You could use that. You can also Google, I mean, if you Google moral minimum, one of the first things that's going to come up is probably the first moral principle is do no harm. Now, there are problems with that moral principle, and the major one is what if you can't avoid doing harm? Think about this. You've got a guy who is, in charge of the Hoover Dam, and why we have a huge flood that comes along. This is not going to happen because what's happening at the Hoover Dam currently? What's happening at Lake Mead and Powell and everything along the Colorado River? Yes.
Drying up?
It's drying up. Why?
Global climate change.
Global climate change. We've had far less snow than we've had in previous times, and more people are relying upon that water source. But let's suppose that we didn't have that problem. There was this huge flood of water and the dam is going to break, and the person at the dam has the ability to divert the water by opening the floodgates and flooding a town of 100 people, or letting the dam break and killing 1,000 people. You can see what the problem is. There's no solution where you can do no harm, right? But that would come, I mean, that's one of the first principles that you'll come up with. Elements of Moral Philosophy. It's an old book. You can probably find copies of it out there, and he has a moral minimum.
Can you repeat
You and
that?
James will.
James, Rachel's The Elements of Moral Philosophy. I believe that's the title of his book. I used to have it in my office. Somebody stole it. Somebody, and they stole it. That's not very ethical.
They obviously didn't read it.
They obviously didn't read it. They borrowed it for one of these exams and it's gone. So hopefully that will help you out. Somebody has asked about, if this is what a C-level answer looks like, what does an A-level answer look like? I have to tell you, I never would have asked these kinds of questions when I was in undergraduate school. I guess maybe I was more afraid of professors than you are of me. Maybe it's the hippie hair that I appear warm and friendly. An A-level answer would be one that uses a approach that analyzes all three ethical theories: deontological ethics or duty ethics, rational absolutism, that's another term for duty ethics, teleological ethics, which is also known as utilitarian ethics, and virtue ethics. So looking at the problem from those three approaches, and then taking a holistic approach in terms of how your solution impacts all of the known stakeholders. And what are all of the known stakeholders? Well, they're the people that are involved in the immediate situation. That's where a lot of students lose points, is just looking at that immediate situation and not realizing that all of those decisions that a business makes impact not only the decision of the business and those people that use the products, but everybody else involved. Society as a whole is either harmed or benefited by the decisions that businesses make. Even small decisions that we think have no consequence beyond the actors, oftentimes those decisions do have consequences beyond the immediacy of the people involved in the situation. One useful method of analyzing these kinds of situations is to use what I call the IRAC. And in the textbook that I wrote, which is published by Pearson, we talk about this method. IRAC stands for all of the issues, identify all of the issues in the situation. So what are all of the issues that you can find? What are the rules that apply? So with regard to ethics, we can come up with sort of 3 sets of rules based on the 3 major theories. Utilitarianism, the greatest happiness principle. That's the major rule. Duty ethics, you define the rule by the duty that is discerned a priori. Never lie. Always treat a rational human being as an end in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. And then virtue ethics, what are the virtues that apply? And what are the rules that apply to those sorts of virtues? So, in the case study, what is, compassion? What is just? Things like that. So the rules, then the application of the rules to each of the situations or each of the issues, and then reaching a conclusion. I graduated in my undergraduate career summa cum laude, which is the highest level of honors that you can get. And it wasn't because I was terribly brilliant, it was because I could write 5-paragraph essays really, really well. My mother would say, Grant, your writing is uninspired. And it is. I've written lots of academic articles. I think I've published 13 now, something like that, 2 textbooks. And my mother, who's an English major and was an English teacher, says, it's boring. Your writing's boring. It's technically proficient, but it's boring. Well, that's the way academics write. This is the sort of way, if you can learn how to do this in anything other than a creative writing course, you can make an A on every essay. Thesis statement. What is a thesis statement? That's what I'm going to prove. Then I'm going to prove it, and then I'm going to tell you what I proved, right? That's the way academics write. I had a student years ago who submitted an essay that began with, did I tell you this story? No. I haven't told you the story. I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a circus tumbling routine. And I wrote back, I ascertained that you deserve an F for forcing me to read this dribble, and you should take a creative writing class to get this out of your system. That's not what I'm looking for, right? Like thesis statement, substantive analysis, conclusion. Here. All right, any questions? Okay, so marketing research. So this is the scientific part of marketing. It's predicated on the scientific method. What is the scientific method? Well, it was largely developed in the 17th century, although I would argue as a huge fan of Aristotle that Aristotle was like one of the first scientists. I mean, he's this guy that's out there. He's largely the system of the way we classify things into kingdom, genus, phylum, species. That was largely developed by Aristotle. It's on his work He's a guy who's out there studying cuttlefish, and he's studying systems of government and coming up with classifications, or what we call taxonomies. But it's certainly refined by the 17th century. It's based on empirical evidence. What does empirical evidence mean? Well, it means that we can count it. We can quantify that evidence. It relies on testable hypotheses. So we come up with a question, we observe things out there in nature, the urban jungle, with regard to marketing. What are some of these observations that we can make? Well, people like to buy. We could test that. One of the things that makes marketing an interesting discipline is that people love to buy. They hate to be sold, by the way. How many of you hate salespeople? You hate sales, yeah. I mean, I teach sales, this attitude towards, this pejorative attitude towards salespeople, it's there because people hate to feel like they're being taken advantage of. But they love to buy. Happiness cannot be purchased. Money can't buy happiness. It can delay depression. We know, using fMRI technology, that when you buy things, the part of your brain that is going off when you experience pleasure is triggered when you buy stuff. It's why we buy all of this stuff. We constantly buy stuff. We create monuments to our stuff called our houses. So it should be testable. So we notice that people like to buy. What is it that they like to buy, right? We can do experiments and see if we can repeat this idea that people like to buy things. We can look at lots of brains under technology when people are buying stuff online and see what happens. It is subject to empirical falsification, so we have to always be aware of the null hypothesis. Karl Popper says, it's the theory of refutation, that all we can really know in terms of science is what the null hypothesis, right? That we should always be aware of it, and that's all we can really prove in science. So if we start out with a very simple testable hypothesis, all cows eat grass. Well, we go out and we observe cows, and if we find one that won't eat grass, this cow likes chicken or something, we now know that most cows eat grass, right? We can refine the hypothesis and then engage in further testing. So always be aware of the null hypothesis. It's very easy to become committed as researchers to proving our theories correct. You have to be, as to the extent humanly possible, objective and realize that you may be wrong in these things. So here's the scientific method. We begin by making observations. What do I see out there? People like to buy stuff. Well, let's come up with something better. What do they like to buy? People like to buy shoes. I like shoes. How many of you like shoes? I have lots and lots of shoes. Allen Edmond are my favorite shoes. I like to buy shoes. I like to buy clothes. Things like that. People like to buy shoes. Find somebody that doesn't like to buy shoes, right? And then we can come up with, well, most people like to buy shoes. So we think of interesting questions. What does this pattern lead to? So we formulate hypotheses that we can test. What are the general phenomena that lead to these things? So in my own research, I focus on the intersection between ethics and marketing. Can we teach specifically ethics and marketing? That's one of the areas that I research. Can we influence people's behavior by getting them the accrediting body for UCO's College of Business is called AACSB. It's the highest accrediting body. So you go to one of the elite business schools, something like only 4% of the business schools in the nation have AACSB accreditation. So you go to one of the elite schools There are lots of business schools in the state that don't have AACSB accreditation. Southwestern Oklahoma State, Northwestern Oklahoma State doesn't have it. East Central doesn't have it. Southeastern does have it. Oklahoma Christian down on Memorial doesn't have that accreditation. Part of that accreditation requires that we teach ethics, and there are ways that we can do this. And so as a marketing scholar, what I'm interested in is, well, if we're going to require that we can teach ethics, or that we teach ethics, can we see if it actually has any impact on individuals' lives? So I've come up with ways of testing this to see if we engage in forcing you to take a marketing ethics course, if you learn anything at the end, and if you make decisions based on hypotheticals and an instrument that I developed to determine whether or not from the beginning of the class to the end of the class, you're changing your thought processes. So we test these, we formulate hypotheses, we develop testable predictions, then we gather data. In my own research, what I do field experiments in this, and we do pre-test and post-test analyses of these kinds of things. Then we develop general theories. That leads to more observations. If we find that we don't explain something, we can either reject or accept the null hypothesis, which means that we need to go back and test more, right? And it's a constant process. Science is constantly going on. One of the things that's interesting in terms of thinking about marketing, how do we get people to take the vaccine? Lots of people are very skeptical about the vaccine. And they say, well, there's just not enough evidence to show that it's safe. What level of evidence would it take to get people to believe that it's safe and to take the vaccine? How do you get greater compliance?
I think it would just have to take time, like maybe a year or two to get people. I mean, we're almost at a year, but it takes time.
So you think we have to have more people with shots in arms? Okay.
Living example would matter, like people who have taken vaccine and they're in good health.
Okay. So seeing the evidence that there are very few people that have adverse reactions. By the way, if you're looking for 100% safety, there's no such thing. People have adverse reactions. Every single vaccine out there has had adverse reactions. Right? I mean, there's no such thing. What about telling people, what are things that you do every day that are more dangerous than taking the COVID vaccine? Driving. Yeah, like everybody said, like every day that you get on the Broadway extension, for those of you who come up from Oklahoma City, you are taking your life in your own hands. It is a killing zone out there. Far more people die in car wrecks every single day in Oklahoma City than have died from taking the vaccine, things like that. So, what can we do to advance science and lead to greater acceptance of these things? This is a marketing problem, right? It's not just a medical problem. This is a marketing problem. How do you reach these people and market to them and get them to understand these kinds of concepts? The interesting thing to me is that the people who won't take the vaccine will show up at the hospital, and it's like you don't believe in medicine to prevent it, but by God, if you get sick, you're going to rely on medicine. And by the way, the drug that they give you if you have a really bad case of COVID is completely experimental. Yes.
Social media is like a good way to like market, but also it has its cons because a lot of people rely on like Facebook to get their information. So many people are afraid to get the vaccine because of what they hear or see online.
Yeah, so I had one of my mother's employees, you'll love this, and I was highly offended at this. One of my mother's employees is extraordinarily apprehensive because she's been on YouTube and she's seen all of this information about the vaccine, and she saw somewhere that they're putting a chip in the vaccine to track you, and she's horribly afraid of this. And so I'm like, Amanda, if they want to track you, they have that already. It's called this device. allows that. I mean, you carry this with you. You are being tracked. If you use credit cards, you are being tracked. In the year 2000, something like 5 billion photos were taken in the United States, most of them not identified. There are billions and billions of photos today taken, uploaded to Facebook. Almost all of them are identified. Facial recognition software is enormously powerful. It's one of the reasons why I told you when you started this class, like, this is broadcast on YouTube. If you're in the witness protection program, it may not turn out well for you. How many times does somebody take a picture of you, post it on Facebook, and you get a notification in 30 seconds or less that they think that Facebook thinks that you've been posted? I mean, it's like, it's incredible, right? And so, like, they can track you. But this is the part that really sort of offended me. She's like, well, I saw it on YouTube. And if it's on the internet, it has to be real. It literally, this is what she says. And my mother says, for God's sake, Amanda, Grant's got a YouTube channel. As if nothing I could say is possibly valid. Like, you know, like, they'll just let it in. It's as exclusive as a bag of potato chips. They'll let Grant have a YouTube channel. And God knows everything he puts out there is, you know, I don't know, questionable. So, you know, but this is again, back to the scientific method. So marketing research, the definition. Marketing research is the process of defining marketing problems and opportunities, systematically collecting and analyzing information and recommendations for actions. It does no good to do research. If we do research, we want to take actions. Taking action on it. It's just an interesting question and nothing's going to come of it. Why should we do it? There should be some reason for doing it. So, challenges to marketing research. The issue of knowledge. Now, at this point, I'm going to switch screens and look at this, and I'm going to see if I can blow it up. Let's see that to come up. Let's see over here. This is a problem. This is a test. So my dissertation used an instrument that I developed. So when you get a PhD, you have to contribute to the body of knowledge. And so you can use other people's instruments, but you have to come up with your own generally. Most committees will make you come up with some instrument that's completely unique to you, that you've done on your own. So, but one of the instruments that I combined with an instrument that I created is called the Ethical Position Questionnaire. It's used a lot in ethics research in business and in other fields as well. It was created by Donald Forsyth. And so the questionnaire consists of a series of questions, and what we look at, it then types people according to the way that they respond. So there are a series of questions that ask you whether or not you completely disagree, largely disagree, moderately disagree, slightly disagree. If you're neutral, neither agree nor disagree, slightly agree, moderately agree, largely agree, or completely agree, right? That's what we call a Likert scale. And you can see Likert scales that use fewer points. This one uses 9 points. You can use 7 points. You can use 5 points. You probably have had a lot of these kinds of questions asked. If you get a receipt from Walmart, they'll ask you to take a survey in hopes that you will be able to win, right? If you enter the survey, they'll put your name in for a $5,000 gift card drawing. One of the things we know about those surveys is that when you do that, initially that was attractive to begin with, but after time, if you don't give people something immediately, they won't take the survey. And that's one of the things that marketing research has shown, is that if you want people to take the survey saying you have the opportunity to win, that's a huge reward, right? Who wouldn't want $5,000 from Walmart, even though it's Walmart? I am like a man going to the gallows when I have to go to Walmart. It's a necessary evil. I have to go at least once a week, and I hate it. I have found evidence that the Yeti exist, and they are at the Guthrie Walmart. And they always bring their Yeti children with them. And they're hulking and screaming, and the kids are grabbing things, and it's a nightmare. I mean, I literally, going to Walmart is a horrifying experience for me. I hate it. In spite of that, for $5,000, I would go to Walmart. You know, if it's a $5,000 gift card, and there's lots of stuff at Walmart that I need. And that's not a small amount. Why doesn't that motivate people? This chance to win $5,000. Well, what we found through survey research, yeah, you had an idea? Go ahead.
This is a lot of people.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Your chance of winning is minuscule. It's like the lottery, although people do play the lottery, but not as many as don't play the lottery. Because the chances of winning, if you want to get people to do research, take your surveys, the reward has to be somewhat immediate in order to get them. Even saying we'll give you something on the next visit, we've found is problematic because it's not immediate enough. Although that works better because it is something. It is an exchange of something. They get a free drink or a free dessert if you'll take the survey or do things like that, right? So you've probably seen these Likert scales. Usually in these kinds of business surveys, they use a 5-point scale where they say, do you strongly disagree, disagree, have no opinion, agree, strongly agree. That's a 5-point Likert scale. You can have these. There is debate as to whether or not you should have a neutral point, because there are very few things, and this is one of the issues that, you know, is a question of knowledge. There are very few things that people are actually neutral about when we ask them questions. Most people have some opinion about it. Even if it's not a strongly held opinion, most people, there are very few issues that people have absolutely no opinion on, if they have any familiarity with the topic whatsoever. If, for example, I asked you today, there's a major election going on in California. The state of California, the voters there have they have submitted a petition to recall the governor. This is not done in many states. Oklahoma, we don't allow you to recall the governor, but because we are a populous state, we have allowed for recalls in other positions. So I think I told you all I used to be vice mayor in Guthrie. And when I was vice mayor, they actually tried to recall me. They sent around a petition trying to recall me because I fired a city manager. They couldn't get it done. They couldn't get enough signatures on the petition to get a recall. In California, it requires very few signatures to get the governor recalled. It's something like 2 million signatures, and the state of California has something like 40 million, I think it's 36 million people. Don't quote me, but it's a lot. And 2 million people is a very small number, so it's very easy to get a recall on the governor. They recalled the governor, and I'd be willing to bet that most of you in this classroom, if I asked you that question, you might not have an opinion on whether or not Gavin Newsom should be recalled because A, you don't live in California, and B, you're not that interested in politics, and C, it's an off-year election. I mean, there's all kinds, but you know, anything other than things like that, you probably have an opinion on. So there is some debate as to whether or not we should have this kind of neutral here, because most people have an opinion. If you say, do you like vanilla ice cream? Most people are not indifferent to that. They have some opinion on it. They might prefer pecan praline or something else, but they have some opinion. So there's an issue here with this Likert scale. How many points should you have? I generally think that, like, for example, this using 9 points, it allows for greater and greater distinction. So when you do statistical analysis, you can get greater variance. So we talked about standard deviation, sigma squared equals large sigma I equals 1 to the nth xi minus the mu squared over n. This is the formula for variance. And a lot of statistical analysis and marketing relies on something called Anova. Does anybody know what Anova is? Stands for analysis of variance. So it looks at populations and tells you whether there's a difference between them using the variance. And so there's debate. You can get the greater degrees on the scale that you get, the more variability you might get. And so that might help you. But generally, is there a big difference? I mean, it's really hard. Although in some of my research, for example, I use something called a feeling thermometer, where you give people a picture of a thermometer and you say, how does this make you feel? And they'll look at it and they'll say about 98.2. But really, I mean, is there a big difference between slightly agree and moderately agree?
No.
No. I mean, I don't know what, I mean, from a qualitative standpoint, I don't know what the difference between slightly and moderately. Moderately is pretty slight, isn't it? So yeah, kinda, I don't know. So, I mean, there's debate about this. So this is a Likert scale. Now let's look at this question and see, this goes to the issue of knowledge. And this is a scale that's used a lot. Let's look at 18. How many of you could read 18? I'll read it to you in case you can't. Let me see if I can blow it up just a little bit more. Is that better? Can most people see 18 now? All right. So the question is, rigidly codifying an ethical position that prevents certain types of actions could stand in the way of better human relations and adjustment. Now, this is a scale that has been validated. So when we develop scales for testing these kinds of hypotheses, we go through validation processes to make sure that A, the scale is reliable, and B, that the scale actually measures what we're measuring. And those are two different things. What's the difference between measuring what we're actually measuring and reliability? Let's think of a bathroom scale. If you have a bathroom scale that is 10 pounds off in the positive direction, it means it may be reliable. Everyone who gets on it is going to read 10 pounds heavier, but it's not actually measuring what you want it to measure, which is what? True weight. So what we want is we want to actually measure what it is that we think we're measuring, and then we want to make sure that it's reliable, that consistently it's measuring this construct over and over and over again. Now, unlike a bathroom scale, where this becomes different is because of language, we have problems. This, although this has been tested in validation studies over and over and over again, this question is problematic. There's one big flaw with this question. So if you can tell me what the big flaw with this question is and you get it right, you get not one duck, but 3 ducks today. If you get it wrong, I'll give you a duck. If you come up with a rationale as to why it's wrong, I'll give you a duck. But if you can actually come up with the real reason that this is really problematic, and this is a scale that's used widely, it's been validated, but there's a big problem here. Go ahead. What's your thought?
It says rigidly codifying an ethical position. I mean, like how that prevents certain types of actions could stand in the way of a better human relations. Like what is to say that the ethical position is right?
Okay, it's not asking you, that's not the fatal flaw. I'll give you a duck, but that's not the fatal flaw, because it's not asking you whether or not you agree with any position. It's just saying, if we have a rigidly codified, so okay, there are two major theories with regard to ethics that are diametrically opposed. If we think about them in terms of the Hegelian dialectic, you've got utility over here, and you've got rational absolutism over here. It's not asking you about either of those. These are diametrically opposed. Utilitarianism says results matter. And in order to get there, you may not be able to develop rules. So what I have to do is, in everything that I think about, in every interaction that I have with you, I have to think about whether or not I'm behaving ethically and analyze the totality of the circumstances and come up with an action that I think is right. That may not lend itself to rules. Now, utilitarians try to fix that by coming up with what they call rule utility, which I won't get into, but rational absolutism says there are rules. There are absolute rules, and we follow the rules, and that's what's ethical. So it's not asking you about whether or not there are these rules and whether or not we follow them. It's saying, if we do have them, if we do have these rules, could that be problematic? It's not asking you whether or not you have a rigid rule. And utilitarianism, in its purest form, is act utilitarianism. You could come up with rigid rule utilitarianism, which says, look, we're going to follow the rules because in the aggregate, it leads to the greatest amount of happiness overall. What's an example of a rule utilitarian position that we could say is, rigidly codified? Well, you have to stop at the stop sign, right? Why do you have to stop at the stop sign?
So you don't hit anybody.
So you don't hit anybody. I mean, there are exceptions. There would be times for an act utilitarian where you could run the stop sign. You have a pregnant wife in the passenger seat and she's going into labor and you want to get to the hospital. It doesn't matter, right? You still have to stop at the stop. And if you don't, now, I think most police officers would use discretion and say, I'll turn on the lights and get you to the hospital. But in theory, that's a rigidly codified. And the reason we have that rule is not because the stop sign is a priori good or bad. It's because if we all don't stop at the stop sign, what happens? Well, it leads to bad results, right? It's not asking about whether or not we should have these rules or what a specific rule. It's asking, if you do have these rules, could it lead to problems? So it's not asking about specific rules. So that's not the problem. Who else had their hand up? Somebody over here? Never mind?
Yeah, never mind.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Anybody else?
It's just that there are no absolutes, that nothing can be an absolute. There's always a gray area. So, but you just explained it kind of.
If you have a rectilinear triangle and one side is 3 and one side is 4, the third side has to be what? 5. It has to be 5. I mean, like, there are absolutes in life. There are absolutes, right? The laws of physics, for the most part, are absolute. I mean, scientists will tell you, and one of my friends who, I like him, he's a nice fellow, but he's not a scientist. And he's got a bachelor's degree, so he's alert and chirpy enough. But he'll read something that I'll send him. He'll ask me a question, and I'll send him some scientific reviewed paper. And this is an example. He's one of these fellows that he's got a bachelor's degree. Now, mind you, it's from a 4th-rate institution in a 5th-rate state. The institution is OU, right? I mean, I realize that everybody thinks OU football. I think OU football is maybe one of the winningest teams in NCAA history. I think if they haven't gone to more national championships than anybody else, it's close. Their academics are 4th rate. They're a 4th-rate institution. They're not Harvard. They're not Stanford, they're, you know, I mean, they're not UT Austin. And he's got this bachelor's degree, does not believe in global climate change, works for the Weather Service, and doesn't believe in global climate change. And so I sent him like all of these journal articles on global climate change. There are no credible studies, people, in refereed academic journals that debate whether or not we are experiencing global climate change. But he'll look at them and he'll find and he'll say, you see here where it says the evidence suggests? Well, they're not certain. That's because in science we don't ever say that, which is why President Obama, when he was president, said climate change is a fact. You'll never find a scientist that will say that, right? I mean, but it's as close to a fact as we can get. The laws of physics and the laws of math hold at all places at all times. Like a squared plus b squared equals c. That's like a rule, and it's absolute. Now, when you apply to ethics, I can see what you're saying. There are no absolutes. I think there are absolutes. I would argue that there are. You know, like you should never kill another human being, you know, with malice aforethought. This is a rule and we follow it rigidly, right? Now, that doesn't mean you should never kill another human being. It says with malice aforethought. And that's the definition of murder, the common law definition of murder, right? And it's an absolute. If you do this, you're going to be convicted of murder. And, you know, I mean, it's the facts that matter as to whether or not you had malice aforethought, which is what we call the mens rea element of the crime. So there are absolutes, or we could come up with absolutes, or we just said this is, and in the past societies have done this. If you steal, your hand is cut off. If they catch you, there is no, I mean, justice is swift. This is the Judge Dredd world. That's a rather old movie. Did any of you see Judge Dredd? Have any of you seen the movie Judge Dredd? Nobody's seen it. They remade it recently, I think. But the original, you know, the police are now judge, jury, and executioner all in one. And if you commit a crime, they just execute you on the spot. All right. So going back to this, so we could do that. I mean, we can create absolutes, even if you said that there are not maybe moral certainty. In the law, we can create absolutes. And in dictatorships, they actually do this, right? I mean, there are absolutes and you follow it or bad things happen to you. And that's what this question is asking about. If we do that, is it problematic? What's the good part about having absolutes? About saying, this is absolute. Don't kill or we will kill you. An absolute. We could do that. What's wrong with that? You had an idea?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, it's a good thing to have absolutes because then we can have like a moral compass. And we know what to
Okay.
follow.
Absolutes are really nice in terms of you know what you're not supposed to do, right? I mean, if we say don't kill, that's an absolute. And there are people who take that position. Quakers take that position that you should never kill.
Okay, but does it depend on the situation? Because if you go back to that river dam problem, if you flood it to the village of 100 people, wouldn't that be better?
Somebody's
than-
gonna die either way,
It
right?
depends on the situation.
Right. Now, what an absolutist would say who says don't kill is you just have to stand back and hope for the best, right? Because you're not, at that point, you're not actively taking part. If you divert it and you kill the village of 100, you're actively taking part in the deaths. Whereas if you just stand back and say, no SB Mesa, not my problem. There's, you know, there's no culpability on your part. Now, other philosophers would say there was. So what this question is asking is exactly this debate is, should we have these absolutes? Or do these absolutes create problems in them? And therein lies the problem with the question, okay?
So if I consider myself in an ethical position and then I set some goals and rules that I have to follow, some people might just not like it. I have some goals, I'm gonna chase them.
Uh-huh.
People are gonna have problems.
Okay. But a lot of people would say that doesn't matter. Like if we set the rules, I mean, like people will always have problems with the rules. That's why we have, I mean, if we didn't have problems with the rules, we wouldn't have a criminal justice system,
Yes.
right? If we had no problems with the rules, everybody would follow them and we would live in a perfect world. That's not the world we live in, which is one of the reasons that we have to have rules. I mean, if we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to have the rules. Because everybody would be, you know, it would be the land of milk and honey and sweetness and light. That's not necessarily the problem. All right, so I'm running a little short on time, so I'll tell you what the problem is with this question. This question, when we think about what it is we can know by asking this question, is problematic because it asks for two things. It's what we call a double-barreled question. What's the double barrel? It says rigidly codifying an ethical position that prevents certain types of actions could stand in the way of better human relations and adjustment. Those are two different things. Sociopaths are really good at human relations. They're badly adjusted. Sociopaths are very good. They're okay, first of all, let me just start. I'm sure that the psychiatry department or psychology department here on campus would be horrified, but I'm gonna break this down very, very simply. Sociopathology and psychopathology, as far as I know, the last time I looked, are not defined in the DSM-5, which is the current version of the manual that psychologists use to identify behavioral issues or personality disorders. They are not defined, but a lot of clinicians will tell you that they are useful terms in terms of diagnosing people with problems. And the basic difference, as I understand them, is psychopaths are like deadly, in theory. Psychopaths are your serial killers. They probably have bad human relations and bad adjustment. Although I don't know, if you watch the television show Dexter, he seems to have good relations with a lot of people. Sociopaths, I'm again being very simplistic and stripping it down. Sociopaths, on the other hand, are very good at manipulating people. They're very good at human relations. But most of us would say that's not well adjusted. If you are manipulating people to get what you want, that's not a good thing. They're charming. Most sociopaths are, from what I have read, they are charming people. There's a book called The Sociopath Next Door. They're good at human relations. They can mimic normal human emotion in order to get what they want. They're not well adjusted. So this asks for two things. When you ask for two things in a question, you don't know what you're measuring. Because somebody could read that and say, it could interfere with human relations. If we say, never lie, for example, this is a rational absolutist concept of Kant's in the categorical imperative, never lie. Well, if you say, I rigidly codify this and say never lie, that could lead to bad human relations, right? It's the reason I'm divorced. Brutal honesty. You look like death in pastels. You are a winter. Go change. Never lie. That could lead to bad human relations. But maybe my ex is better adjusted as a result of that because somebody told her. You know? Or maybe I'm better adjusted as a result. I could be well adjusted. You know, I'm very happy divorced. The best thing about marriage is divorce. I have these students who know that I'm a lawyer, and so they'll come to me because I used to teach the law. I used to teach legal environment of business and the law of commercial transactions. And I have students that will come to me and they'll say, Dr. Gay, my girlfriend and I are going to buy a house together. And we remember from your class that there's certain ways you can take title to a house, and we can't remember which way we should take title. And I'd say, well, why aren't you getting married? Well, we just don't think we're ready for that level of commitment. You're going to take on a 30-year mortgage and you're not ready for commitment? Really? When you decide that you're not ready for commitment with this person that you're buying a 30-year mortgage, it's going to be a nightmare to get rid of that property in Oklahoma. Whereas if you're married, there's a very efficient way of dealing with that. It's called divorce. It settles it. We're just not ready for that level of commitment. Really? You're going to take on a $250,000 project and you're not ready for commitment. I think what you're saying is you're not ready for commitment to that person. Right? And I get that. I think I'm a well-adjusted person, but I don't always have great human relations. Right? And that's what this question asks. Because I say things like this. I say things like, the best part of marriage is divorce. But I'm well-adjusted. I mean, I've taken the MMPI, and they'll tell you that I'm a fairly happy, normal person. I mean, everybody's something. But, you know, I like my life. Not killing anybody. I'm a somewhat productive individual. One of my functional fictions is I come down here and I teach you and I make a difference, right? You know, so this is two things. So it's the problem of knowledge. We're not really sure what we know when we use that question. Issues of bias, social desirabilities, things like asking people, how often do you brush your teeth? Well, most people are going to answer because you know they've done this whole ad campaign for the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years on 2 by 2. They used to say you should brush your teeth 3 times a day. They've now got it down to 2. And they're not sure about flossing, by the way. They've sort of backed up on whether or not you need to floss. But it's a 2 by 2. What's the 2 by 2? Twice a day for 2 minutes, right? Twice a day for 2 minutes. You ask people that, they're probably going to tell you I brush my teeth twice a day for 2 minutes. Because that's the socially desirable outcome. There's a disconnection between desire and action. So we can ask people about their intentions or whether or not they like things. That doesn't mean they'll actually follow through. There are lots of things that I like, but I may not use them. If we're trying out new products, I may say I love it and it's great. That doesn't mean I'm going to buy it. Even if I say I'm going to buy it, there are lots of intervening factors that can happen. So we can have issues between a disconnection between desire and action when we talk about marketing research, which makes it really, really hard. So people will say things like, my friends over in the hard sciences and physics and stuff like that, they'll say, well, you know, marketing isn't rocket science. No, it's harder than rocket science. Rocket science is very easy if you understand the math. And a lot of people don't understand the math, but if you do it long enough, you can understand the math. It operates within very well-defined. The reason we can get people into space is because it's a very precise, well-defined discipline. That's easy. Marketing is hard. When you start thinking about the reasons people do things or if they're going to do things, we can come up with literally thousands of factors to analyze. And we do this. The mathematical models in marketing can become enormously crazy when we talk about structural equational modeling in order to predict sort of human behavior and using literally hundreds of variables to do that. So step 1, we're going to define the problem. So we're going to formulate our question based on observation, and then we're going to develop a set of objectives. What should they be? These are like goals. They should be specific. They should be measurable. We should have specific and measurable objectives. What type of research is it? Is it exploratory? In other words, are we just sort of looking to see where we want to go in the future for future research? Or is it descriptive? Are we looking at how often something occurs? Or is it causal? We're determining how one factor affects another. This is what we often try to do. This is the end goal, is to try and figure out whether or not we can get people to buy our stuff. And then we have to identify actions and have specific measure of success. Then we got to develop a plan. What are the constraints? What are the limitations? So when we're dealing with people, it's getting easier. With more and more, the more scientific we become in marketing, the easier it is, the less constraints. Historically, what we've been limited to in marketing research has been either field observation or survey research. And again, when you ask people these surveys, they may not tell you the truth. There's something called the deviant responder. People will respond, if you give them a survey, they'll just go through and click, right, on the survey. And how do you figure? There are tests that we can do to develop and see whether or not we've got deviant responders. These constraints are becoming less and less as we are now being able to watch things in real time. For example, eye tracking and looking at screens and ads and things like that allows for much greater precision in knowing whether or not people are watching the things that we want using fMRI technology. What data do we need? Do we need qualitative versus quantitative? Qualitative data are things like focus groups, open-ended questions. Quantitative data are hard, things that we can count. The nice thing about qualitative data is that we can get lots of ideas from it. It's hard to generalize from it in many respects. So quantitative, we are limited and we're constraining ourselves, but we get lots of good methods that we can use statistical analysis on. Collection issues. We have to define the population. A population, for statistical purposes, is a well-defined collection of units. That may be a test question. A population is a well-defined collection of units. What is a well-defined collection of units? Well, if I want to know about presidential politics, and I say we're going to sample, for example, this class, that's not a real well-defined collection of units. I mean, we've limited the universe there, but there are problems with that, right? If we want to know about presidential politics, we need to define the universe or the population as what? Eligible voters in the United States. Then sampling. What kind of sampling are we going to need to do? How many people are we going to need to get to participate? And then dealing with these deviant responders in survey research. People who just answer, just check boxes. And it's easy to do now. It's easy to just check boxes because survey research is now what? A lot of it is done online. You all are asked to do survey research. We have a problem with a lot of the survey research that we do here at the University of Central Oklahoma in terms of student perception of instructional effectiveness. You people just don't fill out the SPEs anymore. When we used to do it in class, we had less of an issue with getting participation. We've traded off something. There's a trade-off. When we did it in class, what's the trade-off? Well, we had to have paper forms. We had to have pencils because some of you don't bring, if you're in the College of Math and Science, those people always have pencils. In the College of Business, people generally don't have pencils. They don't bring pencils because you're taking notes, and so you take notes with a pen. Why? It's easier to write quickly with a pen than it is a pencil, isn't it? Particularly like the gel pens, it's really easy if you're writing cursive, which they don't teach, I'm told, in school anymore. They don't teach cursive. which is just absolutely horrific to me. They don't teach cursive. And your generation just doesn't see any purpose in cursive. It lets you take notes really, really quickly. And one of the things we know, or we think we know from research on education, is that if you actually take notes and write it down instead of using your computer, you're more likely to retain it. Why? Because you have to think about it. And I noticed this in my own studies. When I went to law school, I had a laptop and I started taking notes on my laptop. I can type 120 words a minute accurately, which means I can type as fast as people talk. And I can literally just sit there and I'm not thinking about it. If you're taking notes, you actually can't write as fast as somebody talks. So you have to think about what they're saying and put it down in shorthand. And cursive is a way of doing that very, very quickly. So dealing with deviant responders, getting participation, we had to have pencils, then it has to be collected, then it had to run through a machine. What's easy about online? Why is it we've done online? Well, we've eliminated a whole lot of cost, thousands of dollars in printing those stupid forms. And then it's easy to get this data, it's on a computer, and we can just download it. And you can analyze it in no time, rather than having a student worker or student workers over there feeding these forms into a Scantron machine, which is the way we used to do it. And then compiling that data, it used to be done by hand. So they'd feed it into a Scantron machine, the Scantron machine would spit out these reports that would give you item analyses, and then somebody would have to collect all of those for a class and then feed it into, enter it in. Well, now it's all very quick, but we've lost some participation. I'm gonna have to stop there for the day because I gotta go to my meeting. So if you got ducks, come up and see me. And I will try to finish this up quickly on Thursday.
Well, we have it every